But in this parable, Jesus specifically says, I want you to come to me, even when it's painful, even when you're disturbed. She was relentless in her pain. Bring that to him. I mean, even if you say, God, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm not happy, I'm not okay. That simple communication, that is prayer. But in that moment of suffering, of loss, of heartbreak to the core, it's hard to see that God is just, because justice was on the way, but not yet present. Sometimes that love that we have inspires us to keep going, to be that persistent widow, to continue to knock at a door to receive that justice. Motivation can run out. Inspiration stays with you. So welcome to another Women of Valor. Tonight we're going to study the parable of the persistent widow. It's a parable told by Jesus, and the words of Jesus are so important because he gives us a glimpse into heaven, and it's a guide for this life and the next. It's a model to seek after. Most of us know what the model prayer is: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And most of you can finish that, right? It goes on to remind us that we should offer the same forgiveness that we desire from others, and to be thankful for what we've received from God, as he's our provider, and that God's will and way should ultimately triumph in both the heavens and the earth. And this is just a summary of the model prayer that's captured in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. We have not only a model prayer, but Jesus offers us a model attitude when it comes to prayer through the parable of the persistent widow. It shows us an example of how to be persistent, unyielding, and unafraid. And so this is where we will begin tonight's study. So let's turn to the word. Turn to Luke chapter 18, and we'll be reading verses 1 through 8. I'll give you a moment to get there. And reading out of the New King James Version, it says, Then he spoke a parable to them, that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, There was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, Get justice for me from my adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Then the Lord said, Do you hear what the unjust judge said? And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? What a question to ask at the end of the parable. What are your thoughts and what's your interpretation or your understanding of this parable as I read it?
When I read that, I'm like, times are going to be so. When he says that, will there even be faith? I believe things are going to be so hard, or people are going to be going through traumatic stuff that their faith is no longer there.
Mm.
Because if he says it there, there's a good possibility that there's a reason for him saying it there. Will there even be faith?
The remnant, the lack, the minutiae.
Well, he said, what was it? It says that the few elect, even because the few elect will even be misguided.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Even the elect will fall. And what about the rest of the parable?
Well, I go back to what I was talking to you this morning, and he says, this is so she's crying out to him, right? And he's saying, "Won't I answer? Won't I do justice?" But like I said this morning, and he said it says speedily. I think in one place that I read, but God's timing and our timing are so, because the children of Israel waited how long for Moses to come, and he saw the injustice there. He saw them getting beaten. There did come and um, that was, judgment was made, but it took
That
how
was
long?
400 years.
Mm-hmm.
That was 400 years the children cried out to God.
Mm-hmm.
So his 1,001 to 1 day.
Mm-hmm. And I tell you right now, anybody who's in the gym, running at full speed or lifting weights, like, that those, it might be 30 seconds. It feels like an eternity, right? So how long would something like 400 years feel? Especially when your life might be a vapor. And that's what it talks about, I believe, in is it Proverbs or Ecclesiastes? Ecclesiastes talks about our life being but a vapor, right? Just a moment. And it really is just a moment in this life, not an eternity. And so that's one thing that we have to remind ourselves and focus on, that this is not our eternity. This is our temporary. Anyone else? What are your thoughts on the widow and the judge? So the protection and the law for widows is all throughout the Old Testament and right here in the New Testament. The Old Testament tells us not to take advantage of the widow, not to oppress them, that the Lord sustains the widow, and that we are to plead their cases, right? And in those times, a widow was considered to lack a familial covering. Women go from receiving the protection of their father to their husband, and if they outlive their husbands, then their son is supposed to provide for them. If she has none of these, the Bible tells us that by law, she is still supposed to be cared for. The job transfers from one hand to another, but she is not to go without a layer of protection or provision. So let's look into this parable a bit deeper. The parable starts with the status of the heart and the mind of a person in position of power. It doesn't start off with her, it starts off with the judge. The judge has the power to do good or withhold justice. And so this unrighteous judge said that he did not fear God or man. It then moves to the character of a woman who would not give up on seeking what was right for justice, right? There is no mention of the type of justice that she's looking for, just as she deserved it. And we know this because the judge is listed as unjust, but the widow is identified as one who had a right to request it. Without bribe or trickery, just the pleadings of her heart. In the parable, it tells us that the judge, that he was feeling the effects of her persistence for justice. And in the NIV, the translation provides for a slightly different understanding of the parable, because it goes from the New King James Version, which says, "Lest by her continual coming she wear me out," right? But in the NIV, it says, "Because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me." Sounds like a huge difference, doesn't it? And sometimes things are challenging to fully translate from one language to another. If you speak more than one language, you understand that. So it's good to read multiple examples to strengthen your understanding of the original language. If it's not your first language, it will always be a translation based on your first language and your ability to communicate your thoughts, desires, and emotions through that language. So here we are, seeing in both versions that this woman was relentless to the point where it was wearing away at a man who was not concerned with God or man. He was concerned with his own safety, his comfort and well-being, afraid that he might attack her, afraid that she might, or that she might attack him, or that she might wear him out, right? And while we may not know how, like the story of the princess and the pea, we might not know how that feels. We can all relate to having a rock in our shoe at one time or another, or some sand in our shoe, right?
Something
And
that
it's painful. It wears you out, doesn't it?
it's small, it's insignificant, but it's
Something that
annoying.
irritates you
Irritating.
constantly.
Yes.
Oh,
How long will you walk with a rock in your shoe?
Not long. You know you're going to take it off.
Mm-hmm. Something as small as that has that much power over you to make you stop. That's the similarity that I see here between this widow and this judge. So while it might seem harmless and small, over time, it can form a lengthy attack on you, either irritating you to the point where you take off your shoe and remove the rock or clear out the sand, or if it's left where it is, it will cause you a great deal of pain and suffering over time. And I thought this woman, though she's a character created through a parable, was good for us to study because of the example that she brings to us as women, as believers, as someone who prays for things that are near and dear to our hearts.
Relentlessly.
Fervently. And Jesus says that even the unjust ruler will seek justice for the widow to preserve himself. To preserve himself. To save himself, he'll do what's right for someone else, even though he does not want to. God does not need preservation like the unjust judge, because God is so much more. He is a just God. And if we apply that to our understanding of what is going on in our lives, then it changes how we see what's happening all around us. It's like, wearing a different lens, wearing glasses and seeing, going from a blurry vision to finally everything in focus. And as you brought up earlier, I was having a conversation with my mom earlier today. She brought up the suffering of Israel for years and years, 400 years, until they were delivered from Egypt. Do you think that God didn't hear that first cry? Or see that first murder of his people? Let me go one step further. The babies that were being cast into the Nile, 2 years old and younger, or that he didn't want to stop it. There was a deliverer on the way, and timing was everything. But in that moment of suffering, of loss, of heartbreak to the core, it's hard to see that God is just, because justice was on the way, but not yet present. If we're honest, we might have those feelings like, why was Moses spared, but not my child? Why did Moses get delivered into the hands and the house of Pharaoh's palace, but mine to the grave of the Nile? Where's your justice for my child, for my circumstances, for my heart, for my health? How can I see others be delivered right now while I get passed up on mine? Don't we serve the same God? Are we not both praying? We touched on this a little bit last week when we studied the woman with the impure spirit. You might not see the fruit of your prayers, but you don't know what's happening in the soil. I think that's where the perspective needs to shift. I think that's where our vision needs to focus on what's happening in the soil. I'd like to point out that Jesus opens up this parable by instructing the men to pray and not lose heart, as this woman showed us. That's where his attention went. You men, listen to how this woman is teaching you how to respond when justice needs to be served. It means that Jesus knew that some of us would lose heart, that some of us would grow weary from praying without reaping a harvest. And I'd like to remind you that the harvest is not gathered immediately, but it starts with the planting of a seed. Those prayers are the seeds of our harvest to come. And this reminds me of 2 Kings chapter 13. I believe the verses are 14 through 19. And that's where King Jehoash came to Elisha while he was dying from a sickness. And that goes to show you that you can still be a man or woman of God and suffer from the things of this world. The book of Job taught us that. Our flesh grounds us and is a gateway to the pains of this world. And that's important. That's why it's important to fast. We fast our flesh to take back control over it because we're spiritual beings. We have a body, but we are a spirit, right? So Elisha is dying from an illness, and King Jehoash comes to him, right? And he says, he comes to Elisha weeping for the chariots of the horsemen of Israel. And the instruction that he receives were to open the window. An arrow was taken out and it was shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram. And Elisha declared, you will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek. And then he said, he's telling King Jehoash, take the arrows. And the king took them. Elisha took him and said, told him, strike the ground, right? Do you remember this story? He tells him to take take the arrows and strike the ground. And he struck it 3 times and then stopped. And Elisha was mad. He said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have completely defeated them. But now you'll only defeat them 3 times. I bring up that story because what's interesting here is that we don't read Elisha telling him to strike the ground multiple times, but he did. He struck it 3 times. And so if you're going to do something repeatedly, what causes you to stop? Unless you've either reached your goal or you've had enough. And sometimes we've had enough. Sometimes we're tired before we reach our goal. We might not know how many times we need to pray until our circumstances change, but victory is there. And you might walk away from your prayers thinking that all is lost and it's pointless because there's no harvest in sight, but there's movement in the soil. And Jesus shows us this same persistence of striking the ground through someone who was completely defenseless. A widow who's looking for anybody to get justice for her from her adversary. Notice she's not asking for what we would call payback or for some kind of poor fortune to happen to her enemy, but simply that the right thing be done. The posture of her heart is pure. Jesus' instruction to us is not to seek out someone who is unjust. That's not the point of the parable. Or someone who doesn't fear God or the laws of man. He uses this parable as a comparison that if even the unjust man will carry out what is right to end the pain from a rock in his shoe, so to speak, from the ongoing persistence of a widow, how much more will God, who is a just and loving God, who hears the cries day and night of the elect, how much more will he avenge his own? What are your thoughts on that? Do you have a hard time realizing that there's movement in the soil because you're looking for a full harvest? If you've ever tried to grow anything and you water it and you come back the next day and you water it again, you come back the next day and you're looking for that sign of life to break through the soil.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you've ever tried to do that with an avocado seed, it takes forever. It takes forever. And it tells us to have faith as small as a mustard seed. Something so tiny. When will we finally see that burst through the soil? Will we even notice? That
I think
reminds me of what Jesus said when he says, the harvest is plenty, but what?
The reapers are few.
Yeah, the workers are few. So it tells us that we will reap a harvest, that it is there. But it didn't start out full grown. Started out as a seed that was planted and nurtured and watched over and cared for and weeded, right? When we talk about movement in the soil, it has to seek water. It's looking for a source of nourishment. It's looking for the light. Both at the same time, which means it's moving in two directions at the same time. Towards the water, growing deep roots, and towards the sun, looking for that warmth, looking for that light. So sometimes we got to grow in two directions while we're waiting. We got to stay grounded in our faith and still moving towards the light. I think that this parable shows us an idea of a woman. And the only thing that it really tells us about her is that she's lost a husband. It identifies her as a widow. Right? She had protection. So how do we apply this? How do we apply this persistence to our life when we don't see the harvest in full bloom?
To keep asking and not lose hope that it is going to come. But like you said last week, it may not be in your lifetime, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And I know that that's not going to satisfy us. That's just my truth.
Yeah. We are a right now generation. We got free next day delivery, sometimes same day delivery. Like, we're a right now generation. The gentleness of nature. And what I mean by that is how God intended us to be, not how we became, not the modifications of man, but the gentleness of nature, of both growing deep roots and looking for the sun at the same time. When he talks about the seed being cast on fertile ground, or if it fell on rock, or if it fell amongst thorns, right? When it fell amongst the rocks and the thorns, it couldn't grow deep roots. That faith sprout up quick and died. It is important to be rooted in your faith so that you can stand when the wind comes and the rain comes and you get blown around, right? The persistence that this widow had when she was being told no, when she was being pushed away, when she was being ignored, what drove her to come back the next day and the day after that and the day after that? Was it just her won't take no for an answer character? It's not what I see here. I see relentless prayer. I see a relentless heart. I see her not giving up on right things. I don't know if I would call this an entitlement. Do you see justice as an entitlement?
No.
Yes.
Yes and no, because an entitlement is more so something that
Well, it was the woman's, whatever it is that was that she was asking. She wasn't asking for more. She wasn't asking for less. She was asking for something that belonged, that was right to her, whether it was left by her son, her husband, her brother, whatever. That's all she's asking for.
Mhm. Right, she wasn't asking for extra. She was asking for what was lawfully hers.
I guess it's the way that you phrase entitlement
Hmm.
as a negative and a positive.
Mhm.
This
So,
world does that, right?
huh?
Yeah.
So this world does that. Driving is an entitlement, right? Never mind those that, you know, earn the car or get the license and are careful. And is it entitled if you earn it, or is if it's given to you, right? And yet we can't earn God's love. We're entitled to it. We don't deserve it. We can't earn it. Hmm. And receiving it, is that justice or is it mercy?
Mercy.
This story that Jesus is telling everyone who would listen in the square, he's trying to teach them something. And it's that final note that he leaves in verse 8 that we pointed out earlier. He says, I'll tell you that he will revenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? In other words, will you grow weary from not seeing the fruit and lose your faith? Or will you know the God you serve is still working beyond what you can see? And continue your heartfelt prayers and until justice is given, until you have your triumph. Earlier, we talked about Israel and being in the midst of the suffering without a visible and present deliverer in sight, right? I said that when you apply the character of God to your circumstances, that it changes the view of what you see, like glasses, brings things into focus. So glass is off. If God is unjust, then there is no harvest, and your prayers are pointless and they go unanswered. If God is just, glass is on, right? Then when we ask to see spiritually what he's doing, it changes everything. Even if we can't see it, that's where faith steps in. The faith that Jesus was talking about at the end of this parable, that he's looking and hoping to see when he returns. Will you have faith left to believe that God is who he says he is, even when even when what he has done or is doing is out of your sight? That's where faith and trust come in. We can stomp our feet at the ground and say, I don't see anything poking through the soil yet. But we have no idea what's going on below.
This reminds me of, I know it's not a woman's story, but it's a woman. It was Abraham when he was asking for Lot, and the 10 people, so on and so
For
forth.
Sodom and Gomorrah,
And
save it.
yeah, you know, and I looked and I looked, and it was Abraham I never heard that him and Lot ever met again. Like, to find out. He just took it for granted that God was going to do what he said, and he went on his way. He says, okay, you're going to handle it. And that was the last of it.
The same thing as the Phoenician woman that we studied 2 weeks ago, right? The Canaanite woman. She's identified as both. When Jesus said, go your way, your daughter's healed, she took him for his word. She didn't drag him to her house. You're right. The story never recants that they met up because, him and his daughters retreated to, I believe, the land of Canaan, and they went to a mountain, and some not so great things happened there. But you had an intercessor, someone pleading on Lot's behalf, and you had messengers go and retrieve and fight for him, right, to pull him out of the city. But what happened?
Wrong decisions were made.
Wrong decisions were made. It wasn't that the intercessory didn't work. I want you guys to focus on that. It was not that the intercessory and that the prayer and the requests were not heard or that they didn't work, because they were heard, they were granted, and angels went in to go retrieve their whole family.
Mhm.
The prayer did not fail. The actions of man did. Because God did send in a deliverer and pull them out. The wife decided to go against the instruction that was given.
And then the daughters decided that they were going to be the last. If that is that the right story?
Yep.
I just wanted to be sure that.
Yep. They were looking for a way to continue the bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, that's a great story to focus on the fact that we had an intercessor there. We had someone pleading who was relentless, who was bold enough to go before God. If I may be so bold, can I just ask, what if you found 20 believers there? And the whole time I read that story, I go, are you really asking God this? Like,
Yeah.
are you really questioning? Okay, well, what if there was 10?
No, me, I was like, you're pushing it.
Right.
That's a
Right.
personal relationship, because
Yes.
Personal.
like mine's of like, God, I'm trying, I'm really trying. And that's really a personal relationship. You
Mhm.
really know, like, how you treat each individual, how I treat you, Jenny, how I treat, their character, hey, I can't push her that far. I can't,
Yeah.
everyone's like demeanor. So
Mhm.
Yeah. But you recall that this story happened before the promise was fulfilled to Abraham?
Or before the law, right?
He
But
was
the whole
not.
thing is, they were like, put it this way, he had so much confidence in God, he never had to bring up the subject.
He he had a household with no descendants. He had a wife.
look,
He was,
Abraham,
yes.
well, he did bring it up to God,
He brought up the, hey, what do you, my whole estate is gonna go to Eliezer of Damascus.
right?
Right? Because God was like, what do you want? What shall I give you? And he's like, I have no descendants. Everything that you've given me is just going to go to Eliezer of Damascus. In other words, what's the point? I have no
So
descendants.
when he had his son, when him and Sarah had the son
Mhm.
promise, that's when he said, yeah, or all the doubts just vanished, because even his Sarah was like laughing. So all the doubts, yeah, what his word does come to pass, even
Yeah.
though I can't see it. And I just think about, like I said to you today, Jesus on the cross, right? Here's a deliverer, and he's dying on the cross. I mean, visibly, you seeing, my God, with everything he went through, and there goes uh, the promise. There goes everybody's hope, not knowing that just in a few days he would come back,
Yes.
just as his words he said. But so when things look dead to you,
Mm,
that's not the end.
if that ain't a word, when things
Amen.
look dead to you, that's not the answer. That is
Hey,
not the final say. Again, and I think that's a perfect reminder. You have no idea what's going on beneath the surface in that soil, because Jesus was put into the earth and 3 days later he came back out. And it's beautiful. It's again like the relationship that Abraham had with God before the promise was fulfilled. He wasn't saying, well, you didn't give me a child yet, but do you mind going after Lot? He had that bold relationship with him. And prayer is nothing but conversation.
mhm,
It is a conversation between you and God, even when you're communicating your pain, even when you're saying, God, I'm hurt, God, I'm angry, that's prayer. It is a communication and a acknowledgement of your relationship with him. You had an issue today where you could not get a human being on the phone. You were looking for a personal connection with someone to communicate the desires of your heart to someone that would understand what you're asking for. You didn't want to press 1 or 2 or chat line. Like, you wanted to talk to someone who would receive and understand how you're feeling and what you needed in that moment.
mhm.
That's prayer. When we convey that to God, that's prayer. That's it. Simple communication. We have 80 ways to communicate, and I'm, just throwing out an arbitrary number that in this day and age, between text messaging and chat message and social media, and just like we're doing right now over Zoom, so many ways to communicate. It's embarrassing when you don't, right? And people say,
His word says to go into the closet, right? To go into your prayer closet. But he's there when every second. He's there when I just could say, I'm here. I'm here. I need you. I need help. Help. I'm trying to make it through the day.
you know what's important about that prayer closet? If you do it right, the lack of distraction. And what I mean by if you do it right is, leave the phone outside,
Mhm.
because it's your time to communicate with God undistracted, your time to listen to what he's actually trying to say to you, your time to plead your heart at his feet without staring at the messages coming through your phone. This happens all the time in my house, and it's funny when it does because I try to correct it. But if I'm having a conversation with someone and somebody else comes and they completely ignore the fact that I'm in a conversation and start talking, that saying, oh, I'm sorry, did the middle of my conversation interrupt the beginning of yours? Like, in other words, like, wow, you really felt that this was okay. But what the other side of that is, looking for a connection. And so, do we isolate ourselves to look for that connection with God?
I know one thing that, when I get up in the morning and I want to pray, I don't want to hear nothing, because if I hear things, I get distracted, right? And I know I sometimes I feel like I'm a terror. I'm a
Mm.
terror because if he walks from one end of the room to the garage, I hear you walking. I don't want to hear you walking. And sometimes I don't know if he might do.
Someone just passed
I
it.
had to bring it up. I say, I am being distracted. I'm sorry, but I can't. I need to stay. And he like, no one will come next to me or speak to me or ask a question. And I can hear from out, oh no, she's praying. You can't go near her. And it was like, I must be a terror.
Or he respects the relationship that you have with God and knows that that should come first. You know, and that's the thing that we have to
It sounds like fear to me.
It might be a little bit of both. Like, oh, last time I went in there, she went off on me, interrupting her time with the
I didn't
Lord.
even say a word. I just looked.
Just a look.
We know your looks.
I was like,
We know the looks. But it's true. Like today,
I don't want the connection broken, like you said. It's like you may be in a connection at the somebody and the line falls.
and then what happens?
I get
Sometimes you
pissed.
count your loss and you move on and you continue what you were doing and don't go back to that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you might even say, well, if it's that important, they'll call back, right? Well, do you do that with God when your focus is broken? That's the
I
importance of
tell him
that.
about it. I tell him about it.
Mhm.
I say, I'm sorry, or I like we're talking.
Mhm.
And this is not on my mind. What happened here? It's in his word, but I'm missing something. And I ask him. Sometimes the answer comes fast,
Mhm.
like in a few sentences, the next few sentences, and it could be next week. It could be in 3 or 4 months. Sometimes I say, you just weren't meant to know at that moment. But it doesn't mean he didn't answer me.
Yeah. And Mom, you said you were struggling with praying. But in this parable, Jesus specifically says, I want you to come to me, even when it's painful, even when you're disturbed. She was relentless in her pain. Bring that to him. I mean, even if you say, God, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm not happy, I'm not okay. That simple communication, that is prayer.
Mm-hmm.
And that opens up the line, right? In that old song, Jesus on the main line, tell him what you want, right? Exactly. That opens up the line of communication. Because like that flower, when you open up, now you can receive. You can receive what he's been trying to give you or to tell you, or even to take a part of that pain. Not to change. Sometimes we hold on to pain because we feel like it's our only connection to what happened. And God wants to change your heart, to change the experience of what you're feeling, more so to go through it with you. Because the experience, when you isolate yourself from God, you go through it alone. And those footprints in the sand are just yours. When you allow him to come back into your life, when you are this persistent widow, let me change that. When you are this persistent broken heart, you go before God and you request the justice that is owed to you. And he wants to do that. Those were the words from Jesus himself. How much more will God do for you and avenge you? Because you are his child, you are his chosen. Imagine if Abraham didn't intervene for Lot. We have in our lineage of Jesus, when we talk about when we talk about the generations that came before him, we have those that came from Canaan, and we even talk about the Canaanite woman, right? That's the lineage from Lot, right? And yet here she is being, well, her daughter being delivered. It doesn't tell us that this persistent widow was a woman of stature. It tells us that she was broken. And when you're broken, we have to go before the Father to not only make us whole, but to fill our cup. This woman kept going to the unjust judge. And like us, she probably watered the ground with her tears as she went. She received the harvest because she stayed in the fight. She knew what was her right to have. As a widow, she still has rights to a covering or protection, right? Even if everyone in her family left her, or if her husband, son, and father died, it was still a law for the people of God to cover her, to provide for her. And if God created that law, because that was a Levitical law, how much more does he cover us? How much more does he avenge us? How much more is he working it out for our good? You might be crying at the Nile of your own life, looking at what was lost. But the prayers and the cries are heard by God. And he sends a deliverer to avenge us. And that deliverer is Jesus. This proverbial woman of valor, even though it is a parable, even though it's a fictional character, she's an example to men and women, and a reminder that God is our covering, our provider, and our avenger. Your heart might be troubled, your faith might be bruised, you might be tired from the persistence, but a deliverer is on the way. I pray that when he comes, that he finds faith remaining in this world, and most importantly, that he finds that faith remaining in you. That's the power of this parable. That's the message that Jesus was trying to get across. Don't give up, even in your brokenness. Your Father will avenge you, and I will come to deliver you. Have faith. He didn't say perfect faith, just faith.
Size of a mustard seed.
One more time.
The size of a mustard seed. He gives us that much grace.
Grain of sand. It's the smallest seed in the world. You don't need a whole mountain. Just enough. I think that that's a good place to put on our glasses for this week, to focus on what our faith will allow us to see. Do we know what is going on beneath the soil? Do we have faith that the harvest is coming? And the good thing about faith is you don't have to see it to believe it. Right? Thanks for studying with me today, ladies.
Thank you.
Any thoughts on this parable or what we talked about before we close out?
I was going to say that Bible study is just, it's really something that I look forward to. I was in the middle of last week, didn't even realize as I was still trying to handle a situation that I had missed Bible study because I was literally on the phone still trying to handle some things in that late evening. And I went, oh, no, I missed Bible study. And it's a difference, you can tell, because it's something that you do get strength from, or you do get renewed when you're studying and you're around like-minded women. And I will say that it's no coincidence that every week when someone's mentioning something, I'm like, oh my gosh, that same verse was, I went over that same verse, today or yesterday. So it lets me know that this is ordained by God, his divine. I mean, and if you just think about that, this is ordained by God. This Tuesday night meeting that we may not think much of, that we've been faithfully committing to, is ordained by God. Women of all ages, backgrounds, coming together. I have not met you in person, but I feel like I know you more so than better than meeting in person, because the kindred spirit. And to Jenny, if you ever feel like, well, you talked about those, how we reach so many people viewing the Women of Valor, it's still reaching beyond that, because even with my your Woman of Valor book you put out, as we were going through Bible study and I was looking, even when I was at my lowest last week, I wrote some prayers in there. I use it for testimony, prayers, prayer requests, everything. It's like my personal prayer journal. And the prayers that I needed that I could not pray. So Jeanette, that I know that when you just can't pray. I knew I should have been praying, but I didn't have the words. I couldn't even muster the right words. My brother's been sending me these little, and I don't know where he's getting it from. There's so many things out there on social media. It's like a little daily prayer thing. And I read them, but I hadn't read them in a couple of days. And for whatever reason, God led me to those. And literally everyone I read was to encourage me and lift me up where I was at. Everyone. And they impacted me so much that I wrote them in my, what I call my little prayer journal, testimony journal. So it's getting out there. And even when I was able to meet with my counselor, this is not Christian counseling, ladies. This is traditional counseling. But we talk about this prayer group every time. And how she says, oh, it's been a year. And that has been such a great tool for you, your faith. She goes in each group of ladies. And I had shared with her the t-shirts, sweatshirts that Jen had put out. And I couldn't remember where the Bible verse was coming from. I knew what it said. And she goes, please send me the Bible verse when you find it. So believe me, it's getting there. It's going in ways that you would never think. And just to think that here I am in counseling, and even her, she goes, I don't know what passage it is, but remember, peace, be still, and know that he is God. Be still and know that he, and I'm like, here we are quoting Bible scriptures back and forth in non-traditional. It's not, spiritual counseling, but it's like even in that, God is there.
Mm-hmm.
Everywhere I turn, he's making sure that I'm getting fed and getting the encouragement that I need everywhere I turn. So,
Amen. Amen. And while we talk about prayer and sometimes not being able to pray, that's the great thing about the Holy Spirit. It says that he intercedes for us with groanings, right? Conversation is a two-way communication, but it's one at a time. You can't both be talking at the same time, right? So even if you can't muster up the words, even if you can't find anything to say because you might be so overwhelmed with emotions or just completely a blank slate, the Holy Spirit intercedes for us. And that's a reminder to just say, God, I'm here and I'm listening. Even if I can't say anything more to you right now, I'm here and I'm listening. And being present at a Bible study means you're listening for his word. And you're looking for the urgings of the Holy Spirit to give you understanding and wisdom and knowledge of the word. And that is part of communicating with God. That is part of seeking God. And that is a part of prayer.
I haven't seen this verse, and I don't know what he's trying to tell me, but I guess I will in time. What the verse is, Isaiah 60:22. And it says, when the time is right, and then it's in caps, I, the Lord, will make it happen.
Amen.
So he's been putting that when I turn here, he's been showing me that quite a few times of like, I don't know what you're gonna make happen, but you've been showing me this passage, so it's for a reason.
And I do feel like that is coming up soon. And I have my own suspicions about what that is, but in God's timing, all things will happen and all things will be revealed. And Trevor, thank you for the reminder and the encouragement of being persistent, being consistent, being steadfast and seeking that word, and how it does reach others and how it does impact our lives. Because we're not just reading this word and going over these women in the Bible to waste time. We're doing it to add to our lives, to grow a connection with God by understanding who he is through his actions with these women, through how he's provided for them and changed their lives and intervened in their lives. Like, this shows us God's character through and through. And the great thing about God is he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so as we study what was written down about who God was back then, we know who he is today. And we know who he is for us. And we might be in the middle of that storm that Israel went through while they were still in Egypt, but they were delivered, right? You might be waiting for that deliverance of your circumstance. And it's on the way. It's on the way. You might not know how or when, but we know the character of God, and that doesn't change. And we know the steadfast of a father that chastens after his children, who goes and seeks the one when the 99 are saved and the one is lost. He says, okay, I know where you guys are, and you'll keep each other company and you'll keep each other steadfast. I'm going to go after that lost one. Because I'm not satisfied with just the 99. You're important to me too. Even when you're downtrodden, even when your feelings are all over the place, he seeks after you. You don't have to say a word. Let the Spirit do it for you. This persistent widow, she kept showing up. Even if she didn't say anything the next day and the day after that, he knew what she was there for. He knew why she came. And every time he saw her, he was reminded, this is what she wants. Just show up. God knows your heart. And the Spirit will help speak on your behalf and intercede for you like Abraham did for Lot. Great study tonight, ladies. Let's go into prayer requests.